I used to believe that sacrifice was the highest form of love. Every day, I woke up before the sun rose, put on my worn boots, and went to work no matter how tired or sore I was. I worked double shifts, skipped meals, and gave up dreams I never told anyone about, all for one reason: my son. Ethan was my pride, my purpose, my reason for breathing. I told myself that if I just worked hard enough, if I just kept pushing, he would have a life better than mine. And for a while, I believed I was winning. I saw him graduate, saw him smile, saw him step into a world I could only dream about. But success changes people. Slowly, the calls stopped coming. Visits turned into excuses. Until one day, I realized my own son had no place for me in his life anymore. He was rich, powerful, admired, and I was just a tired old man who got him there. That was the day something inside me broke. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I didn't fight. I just stopped. I began preparing for the moment when I would leave this world and leave him a lesson he would never forget. Because sometimes the only way to teach someone the value of love, sacrifice, and respect is to let them feel what life is like without it. And when the day came for Ethan to face what I left behind, it wasn't money, power, or luxury waiting for him. It was the truth. I wasn't born with much. My life began in a small town where the streets were dusty, the nights were quiet, and dreams felt like they belonged to other people. My house was nothing more than 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a flickering light bulb, and a front porch that creaked whenever you stepped on it. But it was mine. It was where I built my life and, more importantly, where I built my son's future. When Ethan was born, I remember holding him for the first time, staring down at that tiny face, and making a silent promise: I will never let you go without. Not ever. I knew I would have to be both mother and father to him, and though that thought terrified me, it also gave me purpose. Every morning, I woke before the sun, made a cup of bitter coffee, and headed to whichever job would keep food on the table that day. Some days, I worked construction under the scorching sun until my back ached so badly I could barely stand. Other days, I took night shifts at the factory, my hands raw from hours of repetitive labor. My neighbors used to ask me how I did it, where I found the energy. The truth was simple. When you have someone depending on you, you find a way. Life wasn't easy. There were months when the bills stacked higher than my paychecks, when I had to choose between keeping the lights on or buying Ethan the shoes he needed for school. And every time, I chose him. My own needs came last, always. Despite the struggles, there was happiness in our little home. The sound of Ethan's laughter as he played with his toy trucks on the living room floor was enough to make the exhaustion melt away. On weekends, we would sit together on the porch and watch the stars, dreaming about what his life might look like one day. I'd tell him that he could be anything: a doctor, a lawyer, even a businessman if he wanted. I always encouraged him to dream bigger than the walls of our house. As Ethan grew, so did his ambitions. He was smart, sharper than I ever was, and he worked hard in school. I pushed him because I believed in him. I saved every extra dollar I could find, sometimes skipping meals, sometimes selling things I cherished, just to make sure he could attend the best schools and have opportunities one never had. When he got accepted into college, I remember crying that night, not because I was sad, but because it felt like all those years of sacrifice were worth it. I drove him to campus in my old truck, the same one that rattled every time you turned the key. I helped him move into his dorm, gave him a firm handshake, and told him how proud I was. He smiled and said, "Thanks, Dad. I won't let you down." Those words carried me through the loneliness that followed. The house was quiet now, too quiet, but I found comfort in knowing that my son was out there building a better life. I still worked long hours, though not just for survival anymore. I worked to help him with tuition, to send him money when he needed it, to make sure he never felt the weight of financial worry on his shoulders. Years passed. Ethan graduated and started his career. At first, he called me often, telling me about his new job, his new friends, the city life that thrilled him. I listened with pride, imagining the bright skyline he now saw every night. But little by little, things changed. The calls came less frequently. Holidays became rushed visits, squeezed between meetings or trips with friends. I told myself it was normal, that he was just busy, that this was what success looked like. Still, I kept our home the same. His childhood room untouched, the porch light always on in case he came to visit. I kept working, not because I had to anymore, but because I didn't know how to live any other way. Work had become my companion, my routine, my anchor. I was proud of my son. I really was. But sometimes, late at night, I would sit alone at the kitchen table and wonder if he remembered the life we built together. If he remembered the nights we sat watching stars, or the mornings when I'd wake up early to make him pancakes before school. Even when I doubted, I never stopped loving him. Never stopped hoping he would walk through that door one day, sit down with me, and tell me about his life. But as the years went on, that hope grew quieter. And somewhere deep inside, I began to prepare myself for the truth I didn't want to face. That maybe my son had outgrown me. That maybe the man I worked so hard to raise no longer needed the man who raised him. It started with little things, so small that I almost didn't notice. A missed call here, a text message that took days to get a reply, excuses about being too busy to visit. At first, I brushed it off. He was working hard, building a career. Wasn't that what I had always wanted for him? I told myself he'd call next week, that he'd come home for the next holiday. But weeks turned into months, and months into years. The visits stopped altogether. My phone would ring only on birthdays, sometimes not even then. I'd sit by the window in the evenings, watching the sun set over the empty road, wondering if this was the price of success, losing the very person you gave everything for. One day, I decided to surprise him. I scraped together enough money for the bus fare and traveled to the city. The place was nothing like our small town. Towering buildings, expensive cars, and people rushing everywhere. I felt out of place, but I didn't care. I just wanted to see my son. When I reached the address he had given me years ago, I couldn't believe my eyes. It wasn't just a house. It was a mansion. Glass windows that stretched to the sky, a gated driveway, and a car so shiny it looked like it had never seen dirt. My heart swelled with pride. My boy made it. I walked up to the gate and pressed the intercom. A cold, professional voice answered. "Who is this?" "It's Mason," I said, smiling. "Ethan's father." There was a pause, followed by a response that cut me like a knife. "Mr. Ethan isn't available. Do you have an appointment?" "An appointment. To see my own son." I tried to laugh it off, told the voice to let Ethan know I had come to visit. But the reply was the same. "He's busy. Please leave your name and number." I stood there for a long time, staring at that mansion, waiting for him to come out. He never did. The ride back home felt longer than usual. I stared out the window, the city lights blurring past me, thinking about everything I had sacrificed. I had given him every ounce of my strength, and now I couldn't even see his face. When I got home, the house felt colder. The silence was heavier. I sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the old photo albums, turning the pages slowly. There was Ethan as a baby, Ethan on his first day of school, Ethan holding his diploma with a smile that could light up the world. I traced the edges of the photos with my calloused fingers and felt something inside me break. I stopped calling as often. I stopped sending money. I waited to see if he would notice. But he didn't. Months passed with no word from him. Eventually, neighbors started asking about Ethan. They had seen pictures of him in magazines, at business events, shaking hands with important people. "You must be so proud," they'd say. I'd force a smile and nod, but inside, pride was the last thing I felt. One evening, I heard from an old family friend who lived in the city. They had run into Ethan at a party. They said he looked different, polished, confident, but distant. When they mentioned me, Ethan had apparently just shrugged and said, "Yeah, Dad's fine. He likes his quiet little life." Quiet little life. Those 3 words haunted me. Was it all I was now? Just a background character in the life I had worked so hard to build for him? That night, I sat at the table and stared at my hands. They were rough, cracked, scarred from years of hard labor. These were the hands that had built everything: his childhood, his education, his future. And yet, they felt useless now. It was then that I decided something. I wasn't going to beg for a place in my son's life. I wasn't going to keep calling, keep waiting, keep hoping he would remember me. If he had chosen this new life, this shiny world where there was no room for me, then so be it. I started selling my things quietly. The tools I had used for decades, the furniture I had built with my own hands, even the truck that had taken me to work every day. Each item I sold felt like letting go of a piece of the past, like erasing the traces of the man I used to be. It wasn't about the money. It was about closing a chapter. I began writing letters, long, honest letters to Ethan, but I never sent them. They were too raw, too full of pain. Instead, I tucked them into a box and placed it under my bed. Someday, I thought he might read them. Someday, he might understand. The house grew emptier, quieter. It wasn't the same home it once was, but neither was I. And though I didn't know it then, I was preparing for something far bigger than just letting go of the past. I was preparing to teach my son a lesson, one that would shake the foundation of everything he thought he knew about life, family, and what truly matters. The days began to blur together after that. I no longer rushed to answer the phone, no longer waited for the postman in case there was a letter from him. The hope that used to keep me going slowly turned into something heavier, resignation. Every room in the house felt like a museum of memories. The worn-out couch where Ethan and I used to sit on lazy Sundays, the dent on the kitchen table from when he dropped his toy hammer, the faded curtains that had seen countless birthdays and late-night talks. Each corner reminded me of time when things were simpler, when love was enough to hold us together. But love, I realized, wasn't always enough. I started to spend my evenings sorting through my things. At first, it was just to keep myself busy, but soon it became a ritual. I would take out an item, an old photograph, a set of tools, a jacket Ethan had outgrown, and hold it for a long time before deciding what to do with it. Some things I kept, others I sold, and some I simply gave away. It was strange how liberating it felt. Each item I parted with was like shedding a layer of pain. It wasn't anger driving me. It was clarity. For so long, I had held on to these things, these reminders of the life I had built for Ethan. But now it was time to let go. The neighbors started to notice. "Are you moving?" one of them asked one day as they watched me carry out an old chest. I just smiled and said, "Just making some space." But deep down, I was making space for something more, a new chapter, one that didn't revolve around waiting for a call that would never come. I kept writing those letters to Ethan, though I never mailed them. Some were angry, filled with questions. Why did you forget me? Why am I not part of your life anymore? Others were softer, almost fatherly. I hope you're eating well. I hope you're happy. I hope you remember that I love you, even if I can't tell you anymore. I hid the letters in a box, one after the other, until the box was almost full. There was something comforting about knowing they were there, even if he never read them. They were my way of speaking to him, of holding on to the connection that had all but disappeared. Meanwhile, Ethan's world seemed to grow brighter and bigger while mine grew smaller. I'd see his name in the news sometimes, a new business deal, a charity gala, a photo of him standing next to people I'd only ever seen on television. He looked happy, successful, like he belonged in that world. But in his eyes, in those photographs, there was something I couldn't ignore, a look that was both proud and distant, as though he had built a life so far removed from where he came from that he could no longer see the man who had carried him to the starting line. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. One rainy evening, I sat on the porch, listening to the drops hitting the roof, and realized how tired I was, not just physically, but tired in a way that lived in my bones. I had carried the weight of this life for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to live for myself. And that was the night I made the decision. I wasn't going to leave my son with anger. I wasn't going to make him feel guilt or shame. That was never who I was. Instead, I was going to leave him something far more powerful, understanding. I spoke to a lawyer the following week, a quiet man with kind eyes. I explained to him what I wanted, a will that would give everything I had, every last possession, to charity with one condition. If Ethan ever wanted to claim any part of my estate, he would have to prove that he had learned the values I had lived by: hard work, selflessness, and humility. The lawyer nodded as he took notes, and I saw a flicker of respect in his expression. "This is unusual," he said softly. "It's the only way I know how to make him see what matters," I replied. As I left the office that day, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. It was as if I had taken the years of hurt and turned them into something with meaning, something that might wake my son up one day. That night, I sat on the porch again and looked up at the stars. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. While I was quietly putting my affairs in order, Ethan's life seemed to grow louder, brighter, and faster. From the outside, it looked like he had everything: wealth, recognition, a name that opened doors. But success can be a lonely place, and though I wasn't there to see it firsthand, I began to hear whispers of trouble. A family friend visited one weekend and mentioned that Ethan had been seen arguing with his business partners at a public event. They said he seemed stressed, angrier than usual, like the weight of his world was catching up with him. I listened quietly, my chest tightening. He was slipping, even if he didn't know it yet. In my heart, I still wanted to reach out. There were nights I'd sit at the table with my phone in hand, my thumb hovering over his number. But every time I thought about calling, I remembered the gate intercom, the cold voice telling me to leave a message, and the empty silence that followed. And so I stayed quiet. Ethan, meanwhile, was living in a world where no one told him the truth. His friends praised him, his employees feared him, and his partners tolerated him as long as the money flowed. But he had no anchor, no one to pull him back to earth. The distance between us grew into a canyon, not just physical, but emotional. He celebrated milestones without me. He built a life that didn't have space for the man who built his. And yet, somewhere deep down, I believed a part of him must have felt my absence. When I stopped sending cards on his birthday, did he notice? When I didn't call on New Year's Eve, did he pause between toasts and think of me? I would never know. The truth was, I had started to accept that my chapter in his story might have ended. I had done my part, raised him, guided him, sacrificed everything to give him a chance. Whether he chose to use that chance to honor where he came from was up to him. But there was still a piece of me that wanted to believe he could change. That one day he would wake up and realize what mattered most wasn't the size of his house or the cars in his driveway, but the people who had stood by him when he had nothing. As I sat on the porch night after night, I noticed how quiet the world became. The cicadas still sang, the wind still rustled through the trees, but it was as though time had slowed just for me. I felt my age in a way I never had before, in the stiffness of my joints, in the heaviness of my breath, in the ache in my chest when I thought too long about the past. I knew my time was running short, so I made my final preparations. I packed away the box of letters and placed it somewhere I knew Ethan would find it someday. I finalized the will, gave the lawyer clear instructions, and even wrote him a note to read aloud when the time came. It wasn't anger that guided my choices. It was love. Love that had been bruised and tested, but never truly broken. Love that wanted my son to understand that life isn't measured by what you own, but by the lives you touch, the people you care for, the moments you choose to show up for. In the city, Ethan's world continued to unravel, though he hid it well. Business deals that once came easily began to fall through. Some of his so-called friends drifted away when they realized he could no longer fund their parties or lavish vacations. He began spending more time alone, late nights, sitting in his study with a glass of whiskey, staring at the city lights. He never said it out loud, but maybe he felt the weight of the silence between us. Maybe he missed my voice, the one person who had always told him the truth, who had never cared about his bank account or his reputation. The story of us, father and son, had reached a quiet, painful standoff. Neither of us had spoken in months, yet every decision we made was shaped by the other. I was letting go, and he was slowly learning what it felt like to have no one to lean on. It was this growing tension, this invisible thread stretched almost to breaking, that made what came next inevitable. My departure wasn't just an end. It was the beginning of the lesson I had been preparing him for all along. And when the moment finally arrived, when the silence between us became permanent, Ethan would have no choice but to face the truth about me, about himself, and about what really mattered. The day it happened was quieter than I imagined it would be. There was no dramatic storm, no ominous sign in the sky. Just a still morning, the kind where the sun rises slowly, casting soft light through the curtains. I had felt it coming, the heaviness in my chest, the way my breath seemed shorter with each passing day. So when the time came, I was ready. I sat on the porch, the place that had been my sanctuary for so many years, and watched the dawn one last time. My coffee steamed in the cool air. My hands rested on my knees, calloused and worn. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. That's how they found me. Peaceful, quiet, like I had simply fallen asleep watching the world wake up. News of my passing reached Ethan later that afternoon. He didn't come right away. In fact, he hesitated. It had been so long since he had set foot in that house that the thought of returning filled him with a strange mix of dread and guilt. But eventually, he came. When he walked through the front door, he was hit by the smell of the old house, by the sight of everything exactly as it had been. The faded curtains, the wooden table, the porch light still glowing as if waiting for him. He ran his hand across the counter, picked up one of the coffee cups I had used that morning, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of the silence. The funeral was small, almost painfully so. A handful of neighbors, a couple of co-workers from years ago, and the lawyer who had helped me put everything in order. Ethan sat in the front row, staring at the casket, his jaw tight. People came up to him with polite condolences. Your father was a good man. He was proud of you. He worked harder than anyone I knew, and each word felt like another stone placed on his chest. When it was over, when the last handful of dirt had been thrown over the grave, the lawyer approached him. Ethan, he said quietly, your father left instructions for you. We should talk. They met the next day in the lawyer's small office. The room was lined with bookshelves and smelled faintly of old paper. Ethan sat across from the desk, his expensive watch gleaming under the dim light, his suit perfectly pressed, but his hands wouldn't stay still. The lawyer opened a sealed envelope and began to read. Mason's last will and testament. Ethan's eyes flickered, his breath shallow. He expected a simple division of assets, maybe a small inheritance. But as the lawyer continued, Ethan's heart sank. My house, my savings, everything I had left behind, all of it was to go to charity. Every cent. The lawyer paused before reading the next part, glancing up to meet Ethan's eyes. However, your father left a clause for you, he said. Ethan leaned forward, his chest tight. The letter was written in my hand. The lawyer read it aloud, every word echoing in the quiet office. Ethan, my son, if you're hearing this, it means I am gone. I wish I could have told you these words while I was alive, but perhaps it took my leaving for you to listen. You have built a life of success, and I am proud of that. But success is not just measured by wealth. It is measured by how you treat others, by the love you give, by the respect you show for where you came from. I gave everything I had to make sure you had a future. All I ever wanted was to be a part of it. The estate you expected is not yours to take. Not yet. If you wish to claim it, you must first prove that you understand the values I live by. You must show humility, selflessness, and a willingness to work for more than just yourself. When you can demonstrate that, the lawyer has instructions to release what remains to you. If not, it will all remain with the charities I have chosen. This is not a punishment, Ethan. It is a lesson. My final gift to you. I hope one day you understand why. When the lawyer finished, the room was silent. Ethan stared at the letter, his throat burning. He had expected money, property, maybe a gesture of forgiveness. But instead, he had been left with words that cut deeper than any inheritance ever could. At first, anger flared. How could he do this? Ethan thought, after everything I've accomplished, after all the wealth I've built on my own, how could he take this last chance to give me something tangible and turn it into a test? But the anger didn't last. It couldn't, because underneath the frustration was something far heavier, guilt. He pictured me on that porch, drinking coffee alone. He pictured the holidays I'd spent waiting for him to visit, the birthdays I had spent alone. He pictured the look on my face when I had stood at the gate of his mansion, asking to see him. And then, for the first time in years, Ethan wept. He wept in that lawyer's office, his head in his hands, tears running down his face. The anger melted away, leaving only grief for the years he had wasted, for the father he had taken for granted, for the man who had given him everything and asked for so little in return. When he finally left the office, clutching the letter in his hand, the city felt different. The noise of traffic, the flashing lights, the busy streets, all of it fell hollow. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt truly alone. And it was in that loneliness that the lesson began to take root. Ethan drove back to the mansion that night, but it didn't feel like home. The house was spotless, silent, and colder than he remembered. He walked through the hallways, each step echoing against the marble floors, and for the first time, he noticed how empty it felt. The rooms that once impressed him now felt like hollow monuments to a life that had cost him everything that mattered. He sat in his study, the letter from the lawyer lying open on the desk, his father's handwriting staring back at him. The words felt like they had been carved into his heart. He read them over and over until the ink blurred through his tears. And then something inside him broke. He swept everything off the desk with a crash, papers, books, and the expensive whiskey glass shattering on the floor. He sank to his knees, his hands gripping his hair, and let out a sound that was half sob, half roar. For years, he had buried the guilt, pushed down the small voice that told him to call, to visit, to say thank you. Now, there was no one left to hear those words. He thought back to all the moments he had ignored. The unanswered calls, the unopened letters, the holidays spent with strangers instead of the man who had raised him. Every memory hit him like a blow until he was gasping for air. When the storm of anger and grief passed, he sat in silence for a long time. Slowly, he picked up the letter again. The last line, "This is not a punishment, Ethan. It is a lesson," stayed with him. He realized then that this wasn't about money. His father hadn't cared about inheritance, about leaving behind possessions or property. This was about values, about the kind of man Ethan had become. And he didn't like what he saw. The next morning, Ethan made a decision that startled even himself. He called the lawyer and asked to see the charities his father had chosen. The lawyer seemed surprised, but agreed to send him the list. When Ethan received it, he sat at the kitchen table and read through every name carefully. Most of them were local: a small food bank, a scholarship fund for underprivileged kids, a shelter for single parents. As he read through them, he saw a pattern. These were all places that reflected Mason's life, his struggles, his values. Places that might have once helped him when he was raising Ethan on his own. Ethan felt ashamed that he hadn't thought about any of this before. He had spent his adult life in a world of luxury, attending galas that claimed to raise money for charity. But here were real organizations doing real work, and his father had chosen them over him. Something in Ethan shifted. He decided to visit one of the charities personally. He didn't send an assistant or make a formal appointment. He drove out of the city in a plain car, dressed simply, and walked into the small food bank listed first on the document. The building was modest, nothing like the polished halls he was used to. Inside, volunteers bustled about, stacking boxes of canned goods and greeting families as they came in. No one recognized him. No one cared who he was or how much money he had. He asked to speak with the manager and introduced himself quietly. "My father, Mason, left part of his estate to this place," he said. "I just wanted to see what kind of work you do here." The manager smiled warmly and gave him a tour. She explained how the donations kept the shelves full, how many families came in each week, how they relied on people's generosity to survive. Ethan listened carefully, his throat tight. When they finished the tour, the manager handed him a clipboard. "Would you like to volunteer for a bit?" she asked. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He had business meetings, calls to return, a world that always demanded his attention. But he remembered the letter, remembered his father's words, and nodded. He spent the next few hours packing boxes, carrying crates, and handing food to people who thanked him with tired but grateful smiles. His shirt was damp with sweat, his back ached, and his expensive shoes were scuffed by the concrete floor. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something real. When he got back into his car that evening, his hands were dirty, but his heart felt lighter. Ethan returned to the food bank the next week. This time, he didn't hesitate. He rolled up his sleeves, tied on an apron, and worked alongside the volunteers from morning until late afternoon. He lifted crates, sorted cans, carried bags out to waiting cars. People greeted him by name now, not because he was wealthy or well-known, but because he had shown up. And for the first time, he understood why his father had chosen these places. Here, there was no pretense, no titles, no expectations. just people helping people. At night, when he came home exhausted, he would sit at his desk and reread his father's letter. The words no longer felt like a judgment, but like a guide. Slowly, the anger that had once burned in him turned into resolve. He didn't stop with the food bank. He visited every charity on the list: the scholarship fund, the shelter for single parents, a program that repaired homes for struggling families. Each visit chipped away at the shell he had built around himself, forcing him to face how far he had drifted from the man his father had raised him to be. At the shelter, he met a young single father with a little boy not much older than he had been when Mason started working 3 jobs. The man was quiet, his hands rough, his clothes worn. He reminded Ethan so much of his father that it hurt to look at him. "Why do you do this?" Ethan asked him one day, watching as he fixed a broken chair in the shelter's common room. The man shrugged. "Because my boy needs me too. That's what fathers do. They keep showing up, no matter how hard it gets." Ethan had to excuse himself and step outside. He leaned against the wall, breathing hard as tears stung his eyes. That night, he opened the box of letters his father had left for him. He read every single one, some angry, some tender, all written in Mason's careful handwriting. By the time he reached the last letter, his shirt was damp with tears. He realized then that his father had never stopped loving him, never stopped hoping he would come back. Even in the silence, Mason had been speaking to him. The next day, Ethan made a choice. He began selling off pieces of his old life. The expensive cars he barely drove, the art that hung on his walls but meant nothing to him, the designer clothes that no longer felt like they belonged to the man he was becoming. He used the money to expand the charity's reach, to create scholarships in his father's name, to repair homes for families like the one Mason had once struggled to keep afloat. Each act felt like a step closer to forgiveness, not from his father, but from himself. It wasn't easy. There were moments when he wanted to run back to his old life, to bury himself in work and ignore the pain. But every time he was tempted, he thought of Mason sitting on that porch, waiting for a son who never came. One evening, as the sun set, Ethan drove back to his childhood home. The house had been left exactly as it was, per the will's instructions. The porch lights still worked, casting a faint glow in the growing darkness. He sat on the steps, just as Mason had done so many times, and let the quiet settle around him. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered into the night. "I should have been here. I should have called. I should have said thank you 1,000 times, and I didn't. But I'm here now, and I promise I'll spend the rest of my life honoring you." For the first time, the weight on his chest lifted. When he stood, he didn't feel like the man who had walked away from his father years ago. He felt like someone new, someone his father would have been proud of. Weeks turned into months, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't heavy with regret. It was purposeful, reflective. Ethan had transformed his days into something that mattered. He still ran his business, but with a new sense of balance. His time was split between work and the causes his father had supported. The mansion, once a lonely monument to his success, now became a place where community meetings were held, where charity organizers gathered around the dining room table to plan events. But there was one thing left for Ethan to do, one final step that would close the chapter his father had left open. On a bright spring morning, Ethan drove back to the small cemetery where Mason was buried. The grass was green and fresh, the air carrying the soft scent of blooming flowers. He brought no flowers this time. Instead, he brought the box of letters his father had written to him, worn from weeks of reading. He knelt by the headstone and placed the box carefully at its base. "Dad," he said softly, his voice trembling, "I've read every word, every single one, and I finally get it now. You weren't trying to punish me. You were trying to save me from myself." He sat back on his heels and let the tears come. They weren't the violent, angry tears from before. These were quiet, cleansing. "I thought money was the goal," he continued, speaking as though Mason were sitting right there beside him. "I thought success meant distance, meant proving I could do it on my own. But now I see that everything I am, everything I ever became, started with you. Your hands built my future. Your sacrifices built my dreams. And I forgot to thank you." The wind stirred gently through the trees, and for a moment, Ethan could almost hear Mason's voice, calm, steady, reassuring, telling him that it was enough. "I've started giving back," Ethan said, his voice growing stronger. "I've funded the charities you cared about. I've met the people you wanted to help. I've even got my own hands dirty, just like you did every day of your life. And it feels good. It feels real. For the first time in years, I feel proud of myself. Not for what I own, but for what I can give." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter his father had left him. The edges were frayed now, soft from a number of times he had held it. "I'm keeping this one," he said, tucking it back into his jacket. "Not as a reminder of what I lost, but of what I found. You wanted me to learn humility, selflessness, and hard work. And I'm going to keep learning every single day for as long as I live." When he finally stood, he felt lighter than he had in years. He left the box of letters behind, a symbol that he no longer needed to cling to the past. He had absorbed the lesson, carried it into himself. That evening, Ethan returned to the house one last time. He walked through each room slowly, running his fingers over the worn furniture, the cracked walls, the old photographs. This house had been his father's sanctuary, his place of love and struggle, and now it would be someone else's. Before leaving, he locked the door and placed the key on the windowsill, a final gesture of closure. Later that month, he arranged for the house to be donated to the local shelter for single parents, turning it into a safe space for families who needed a place to start over. He attended the dedication ceremony quietly, standing in the back as the shelter director unveiled a small plaque by the door. "Mason's house, a place of second chances." Ethan smiled through the lump in his throat. Mason's name would live on, not as a memory of what was lost, but as a beacon of what could still be built. From that day on, Ethan carried his father's lessons into every corner of his life. When business partners suggested deals that felt exploitative, he walked away without hesitation. When employees needed help, he offered it without expecting anything in return. And when people asked him about his success, he always said the same thing: "I didn't build this alone. My father gave me everything I needed to start." This is his legacy as much as mine. Years later, when Ethan stood at a podium accepting an award for his philanthropic work, he didn't speak about profits or expansion. Instead, he spoke about Mason. "My father was a simple man," Ethan told the crowd, his voice steady. "He worked hard his entire life. Not for glory, not for riches, but so that I could have a chance. I lost my way for a while, but he found a way to bring me back, even after he was gone. Everything I do now, I do because of him. This isn't just my success. It's his." The room rose to its feet in applause, but Ethan wasn't thinking about the crowd. In his heart, he was thinking about Mason, about the porch, the morning coffee, the quiet strength that had shaped him. And for the first time, Ethan knew that if Mason were there, he would be smiling. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to think about the people in your own life who shaped you, the ones who sacrificed quietly, who showed up for you when no one else did. Maybe it was a parent, a grandparent, a mentor, or a friend. When was the last time you told them what they mean to you? Mason's lesson to Ethan wasn't about money. It was about gratitude, love, and remembering where you came from. Too often, we wait until it's too late to say thank you, to pick up the phone, to mend what's broken. Don't wait. After this video ends, reach out to that person who gave you their time, their energy, their love, and let them know. I'd love to hear from you too. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had a moment like Ethan's, where life forced you to slow down and re-examine what really matters? Did you ever have a falling out with someone you loved and find your way back to them? Your story might inspire someone else who is struggling right now. And if this video resonated with you, please consider giving it a like. It really helps get stories like this in front of more people who might need to hear them. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next powerful story we share. Next week, we're releasing another emotional journey about a man who thought he lost everything, until life surprised him in the most unexpected way. You won't want to miss it, because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't just about loss. They're about what we gain when we finally learn to open our hearts again.